Good morning, everybody. I have the dubious or wonderful privilege to be given the opening remarks this morning. My name is Maya Akuyero. I'm a partner at McKinsey and Company based out of our Lagos office. I lead the work we do with fintechs across Africa, and as Tolu mentioned just now, we wrote a report about a month ago, just over a month ago, looking at the fintech landscape in Africa, trying to understand, because there's a lot of noise and a lot of excitement about fintechs in Africa. So we wanted to sort of bring together a body of work that really puts in one place what is happening in the Africa fintech landscape. We looked at sort of sizing, we looked at the activities, and so on and so forth. And I will share with you a few highlights from the report. Wonderful, the presentation is here. We called our report the end of the beginning for fintechs across Africa. And a lot of people said, that's a very interesting name. Why do you call it the end of the beginning? And there were a number of reasons we thought that fintechs were coming to the end of the S-curve in Africa. The first thing that I would say is that when you look at the size of revenues of fintechs in Africa and see how they've penetrated the financial services system, across Africa, we're about 3 to 5%. Nigeria specifically is around 3% of total financial services revenues. And those numbers are actually very similar today to what you would see in more developed markets such as the US, the UK, and so on and so forth. So from a revenue perspective, we're actually, almost on par or at par with more developed markets. The second reason that we said, look, we're at the end of the beginning was that when you looked at, the maturity cycle and the activities where fintechs across Africa and again in Nigeria are participating in, we've sort of built a lot of the fundamental rails that help to drive fintech activity. And now we're seeing more and more fintechs come into more and more complicated financial services. So that's another point to note. The third point to note is, I'm sure everybody is aware of all the news and all the press that you've been seeing about startups and fintechs. And we see sort of 3 or 4 big issues and big challenges that fintechs will have to face. Again, very similar to what you would experience in other sort of more developed markets. These challenges include the challenge of scale. How do you make sure that you are building businesses that have both the number of customers, but also the revenue growth to warrant some of the investments going in there? The second thing is navigating an uncertain regulatory framework. A lot of our fintechs today in Africa are operating in one market, but a lot of people also have ambitions to go across markets. However, one of the things that you would hear is that regulation in Nigeria is very different from regulation in South Africa. It's very different from regulation in Ghana, even within the same common market area. So navigating that has been one of the big challenges we've had to face. Thirdly, and I think it's very important, in fact, even today there was news in the press about this, which is building very robust corporate governance and robust sort of systems around the ideas that we're generating. And then finally, and I think this one is a big one for fintechs, for incumbents, for anybody operating in this market, which is a talent question. And I know there's a panel around talent later on, either today or tomorrow. But the big talent question is a problem that we all collectively have to address if we're going to build sustainable businesses on the continent. So if you please go to the next page. Thank you. And sorry, I'm a consultant, so we like to bring PowerPoint slides. I think this is a very exciting picture. I apologize, it has a lot of different, actually, I think you skipped a page. Can you go back, please? Thank you. And go back. Thank you. Wonderful. What we try to do, because everybody says fintech, and we try to actually lay out the activities that fintechs participate in. On the left-hand side of the page, we start with a very simple, what we call account management. So basically opening an account, a wallet, whether it's a digital bank or so on and so forth, all the way to the more complicated on my right-hand side, which has to do with things like wealth management, blockchain, cryptocurrency, and so on and so forth. And under each one of those verticals, there are sub-activities that we see fintechs playing in. And then underlying each one of these activities are an operations and infrastructure layer. So we just actually just try to say, let us map. Because at my last count in Nigeria, I think we have close to 400, 500 fintechs. Across Africa, I think the number is maybe 2,000. So we wanted to actually just map out what are the activities that we see fintechs playing in, so people can begin to understand what is going on there. On the next page, we saw that the predominance, if you just flip down to one more page, please, we saw that the predominant activities for fintechs in Nigeria, actually, but also Africa, is to the left-hand side of the page, right? So a lot of fintechs are involved in wallets and peer-to-peer payments, bill payments, remittances on the customer side. And then on the B2B side, we see offline payments and online payments as well. Where we're not seeing as much activity, I think there is a bit, is sort of retail lending, wealth management, and some of the more complicated financial services I had talked about. I think the good news, though, is that when you think about the fundamentals and the rails to actually power what I would term more advanced financial services, we are actually quite well penetrated in Nigeria and across the continent. So I think this is a really bright spot for us as we think about where we're going. And then the next page then sort of takes all those categories and says, what does the market look like? For me, there's a number of reasons for excitement. One is if you look at the growth, and this is historical growth of these areas, and what we did was we tried to size, what is the pool of money that is available for fintechs to address. If you look at the growth rate of 9% between 2015 and 2020, that is above GDP. If we all agree, I think the last numbers I saw for our average GDP between 2015 and 2019 was close to, call it 2-3%. So the financial services industries and the pool of money that is available to fintechs has been growing above GDP. And it's even projected to grow even further, driven by a number of things. One is that we have a very young population. Average age is 20, which means that the early adopters are the bulk of the population and they will continue to use the products. I think the second thing that also gives a lot of sort of optimism is actually looking at the investment flows that have come into Africa. We've seen a lot, and even Nigeria. Nigeria alone contributes 45% of all investments into the fintech industry in Africa between 2015 and 2020. Thirdly, this is a very innovative, every day there's new ideas coming through. So we feel like there's a lot of reason for a hope and optimism. A couple of verticals that are growing quite fast. One is wallets. We expect to see a lot of wallets sort of coming up in the future with the approval of licensing of PSB banks and so on and so forth. The second is also retail lending. If you look at other markets where that has been sort of relatively, how would I put it, democratized, we've seen quite a high growth in retail lending. Thirdly, remittances, which is where a market that collects a lot of remittances flows. Unfortunately, I don't think the last mile delivery problem has been solved yet, but there are a few, again, very, very interesting companies coming up in that space, and the margins are relatively high. So we expect to see quite a lot of growth there. All right, on the next page, I just put this here to sort of take a zoom out and say, where is Nigeria relative to Africa and what is happening across Africa? We have sort of 4 categories of markets when we see fintech. And I think one of the things that is actually very specific to our climb is the fact that when we talk about fintech, we talk about 3 types of entities. We have our telecom operators who are heavily involved in other markets with mobile money and so on and so forth. We have the banks, right? And then we have what I would term the new ventures, also all participating in what I would term as the fintech revenue pools. However, the dominance of those 3 players are very, very different depending on the markets you're looking at. For us in Nigeria, we term us as a disrupted market because, one, We have what I would term the rails to enable sort of fintech activity. We have instant payments, and we have quite a lot of dynamism in the industry. Unlike a Ghana next door, where the bulk of the what I would term the fintech activity there is driven by the telcos. So they have 150% of their GDP moving through mobile money today. So it's very much a mobile money led market. If you look at a South Africa, a Morocco, there are a lot of the innovations that are actually coming from the banks, and the banks have a very, very high hold on sort of the disruption in the financial services market. And then what I would term as the crossroads markets, such as the ones in Francophone West Africa, where you have relatively, I would say 50-50 participation of telcos, of disruptors, but also of the banks. So there, the jury's out as to who's going to win in those markets. Finally, if you just move to the last slide, I think to unlock the true potential of fintechs, I think it's and one of the reasons I'm really excited about what is happening in this room today is that you have so many different types of players coming together to have a conversation about this industry. But I think we think about three levels of participants that need to come in and help drive growth in the industry. I think one is the role that the regulators have to play in encouraging sort of innovation, but also ensuring that customers are protected. Secondly, fintechs and incumbents. I think here the big question is, how do you build talent and train? Every day, I was telling someone, every day I get a request to say, are there any ex-McKinsey consultants who would love to come and work in my startups? People are always talking about, I'm looking for a CFO, I'm looking for a CEO, I'm looking for somebody, right? So the talent question is a very important one. And then the question that we also have to ask ourselves is, do we need to build in the fact that even though we train talent is very, very fungible because people are going and moving up and down. So how do we make sure that we build in the right redundancies, given that people are also moving up and down, and then also partnering, right? I think if you look across the world, and actually also in Africa and in Nigeria, how do we come together? Because I don't think people always ask me, who's going to win? Is it telcos? Is it going to be fintechs? Is it going to be the banks? I actually think that the problem that we are trying to solve requires everybody to come together. We're in a country where 40% of our adult population still doesn't have access to financial services. So everybody has to come together to solve the problem. And then finally, investors, because I think we're going to need capital and patient capital to grow this industry. So we talk about the work that they need to focus on value over valuation and ensuring that we're building right, sustainable businesses that are addressing the issues in our markets. So finally, I have one more slide that I would like to share with you. I think just to recap, I think there are sort of 5 key messages. One is that the fintech is booming on the continent. I think it's a bright spot that has grown despite all that's happening in our markets today. I think our digital infrastructure to support it is still developing, but we have the right fundamentals for the most part. I think that multiple income streams are very, very necessary for us to grow. And I think this is where we talk about value over valuation and ensuring that we're building the right businesses that can solve the problems that we have. And then finally, ensuring that there is the right regulatory environment to support our businesses. Thank you very, very much.